coming. Appreciate everyone coming in person, and thank you to all of you joining online. We've got a great event, COP28 and the Roadmap to Climate Optimism. As we know, COP is starting in just 2 days, and there's a lot to unpack about what's happening in the space and what we can expect. So we've got a great panel for you, which I will moderate. But first, Alex Thompson, who is our Global Chair of Corporate Affairs and Impact, is going to talk to us a little bit about our latest study, Trust and Climate Change. And Alex, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heath. Thanks everyone for coming. I would sort of stand up and walk around, but I've got to do this weird thing of addressing the camera because there are people online as well, and then I'll sort of be speaking to both sides of the room. But if you're on the camera and you don't feel loved, because I'm looking at real people in the room, so forgive me about that. I'm going to move through quite a lot of content quite quickly, if this clicker works. Excuse me, sir. Oh, there we go. I'm going to move through quite a lot of content quite quickly. Feel forgiven for staring at the screen. Don't worry about what I'm saying because the data is quite rich. I'm going to be talking in 2 capacities. So one is an advisor to, of course, our clients, but second is having been on the in-house side, most recently as Chief Communications Officer for Thomson Reuters, and before that, running sustainability for REI, philanthropy, comms, brand, and so on. So as a relatively new returner to Edelman, having spent a good part of my career previously, this data was one of the first sets of information that I was sort of hit with as I re-entered the organization. And as a practitioner, I think some of the findings are really profound here. And some of it's quite intuitive, but some of it's quite practical. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. First thing to say, this is the 3rd study of its kind that Edelman has done. 14,000 respondents, nearly 14 countries. And this is, of course, a partner to our bigger trust surveys. And it's very, very focused on the question of what is the role of pessimism, what is the role of hope and optimism? And we really click into that. So firstly, what's the big picture? 93% of the people who we spoke with consider the climate crisis as being a real thing. I believe that climate change poses a serious and imminent threat to the planet, 93%. So this question of does it matter to people is an absolute clear answer. But if you look at underneath the 93%, 50% have come to see this over time. So we've seen a shift in perception. And again, this is self-reported. Second, it is becoming more personal. 72% see climate change as making life extremely difficult and unpleasant for an individual and my family, so this small unit. And you can see the other statistics here that actually my health has gotten worse recently as a result of that. 45%, 71% seeing weather becoming more extreme. Now, of course, we know there are conversations to be had about how media and we talk about the link between climate and weather, but this is the perception. The big picture is that we've seen not only sort of a up and to the right in terms of our concern about climate crisis, but we've also seen a worrying trend, which is significant downward pressure on trust in all 4 institutions of media, business, government, and NGOs. This is quite an important slide. If you've been exposed to Edelman's trust data in big trust, as we would describe it, business is the most ethical and most competent institution consistently now. It has moved into the 1st position. On climate, it is the 3rd. So it's in the 3rd, it's the, you can see media, business, government, NGOs. So there's downward pressure on all these institutions, and these statistical drops were significant enough to really concern the research team. So important to be aware of this. Only experts now and peers are trusted for climate information. Now, I think the folks that are gathered in the room here today, and some of you online, will be very well aware that the role of a scientist or an expert in being a trusted source of information or a peer has always been important. But we've obviously had a lot of pressure to rethink the role of science and expertise on any issue, including climate. Well, this is pretty clear. 73% of people consider scientists and experts as being the most trusted source of information, but all the way down there on the left-hand side at 36% CEOs. So again, we've got downward pressure on all of these groups, but that's a pretty stark contrast, and it gives us something very specific to think about when we consider who we want speaking about these issues and how. Most countries are distrusting each other on climate as well. So we've looked at how do we feel about the institutions, the big four institutions. The question of whether we actually think that other countries are going to do what's right is also something we've explored. Now, this is a bit of a slide to kind of get your head around, but we essentially asked everybody, we asked people in India to the extent to which they trust every other country other than India, if that makes sense. And so you're seeing the perception of others reflected on this slide. Canada, of course, on the right-hand side, being the most trusted of all countries, just spent 3 years living in Canada, take no credit for that. Anyway, 3 in 4 are worried about climate change, and the majority are pessimistic about solutions. 3 in 4, and the majority pessimistic. So 77%, if you're looking for lead statistics here, are worried about climate change. But the breakdown here is really the springboard for the rest of this study. 55% of this group are not only worried, but they're pessimistic. What do we mean by pessimistic in this study? I'm worried about climate change, and I am not hopeful we can overcome its challenges. So this is a blend not only of the macro perspective, but also how do we feel about the path forward? 55%. We'll unpack that more later. Right. So this slide looks at the link between trust in institutions and optimism. We're going to start talking about optimism a bit. And the way I think about this is, or we think about this is, there is massive downward pressure on climate optimism if somebody does not have trust in institutions, right? So again, when we think about institutions as, again, media, non-profit, government and business. If you don't trust institutions, the likelihood that you have optimism in climate, very, very low. And so that grey box there is indicating this massive downward pressure. By contrast, if somebody is optimistic, you are much more likely to be involved in climate advocacy in one form or another. So this slide is showing that if you are an optimist in that first column, global cooperation, you are 17 points more likely to believe that the climate agreements, like the Paris Agreement, are going to help address climate change. The second piece, policy, 21-point difference. Third, peer action. I'm 20 points more likely to put pressure on my friends or family to live more climate-friendly lives if I'm an optimist. Let's unpack some of this data and go a bit deeper so we get more granular and we start moving forward to practical. But government, very specifically, government is now considered to be doing well by only 35% of our respondents, only 35%, on balancing climate needs with reliable and affordable energy, which of course is a tension point in this narrative and the problem. And only 34% balancing climate solutions with economic recovery and growth. So as we think about how we frame these problems, we've got significant downward pressure again as a result of government's perceived competence. On geopolitics, Global South, developing countries, they are very concerned about the fairness of climate financing. It's a really critically important conversation this week. It's unfair for countries not responsible for causing climate change to pay for addressing the problem. And by contrast, developed countries are highly skeptical of global treaties. And this isn't a slide that I was expecting to see as we got the fielding at the research out of field. So across developed countries, only 39% agree that global treaties are going to be effective, which is a stark finding when you think about the amount of effort that we're really investing in these global treaties. Business, climate commitments are in doubt. So 65% of people think that the companies are not doing well at living up to their climate change commitments, 65%. And the breakdown there on the right-hand side is pretty clear. So 49% thinking companies are too focused on short-term profit, and the 31% at the bottom, leaders fearing backlash. And I suspect that CD and others will talk about this a little bit as we had a conversation about a couple of weeks ago. What's the mindset of leadership in a moment where scrutiny is increasing and criticism is increasing? How are NGOs doing? Not enough to catalyze change. So only 39%, I'm sorry to say, think that NGOs are doing well, partnering with government and business to develop and execute climate change solutions. So this isn't saying that 39% think that NGOs are doing badly writ large. It's a very specific part of the problem, partnerships between business and government. and only 37% thinking that they're doing a good job certifying or offering consumer guidance on carbon-friendly products or services. Those of you who are in the room representing business, in particular consumer-facing businesses, may have a point of view about whose job it is to provide consumer guidance on carbon-friendly products. Be an interesting conversation point, but interesting nonetheless. So the opportunity that we're missing, let's unpack this. Majority worldwide, not only do we see 97% of people thinking that climate is a real and immediate issue and crisis, 67% of people consider there to be a meaningful gap between how climate-friendly my lifestyle is versus how I would like it to be. And it's like an occupational hazard that this conversation comes up at Thanksgiving. I can say that it was like hours-long conversations about this with a relatively wide array of family members, put lightly. And what does it mean to close that gap? So I suspect that you all are thinking similarly. I feel this on a day-to-day basis. It's, I think, reassuring to know that people do want to make progress. What does that progress look like? Barriers. Cost, top barrier. 80% believe that cost is the biggest barrier in keeping people from making climate-friendly lifestyle. This stat didn't surprise me at all. But I will say that when you look down this list and think about what we as communicators, brand people, public affairs people, pick what label you have, sustainability professional, can we provide better information on products and solutions? I hope so. I mean, that's our stock in trade. So I think there are some elements here where you can move the ball. And if you're a business that's developing products, the need for climate-friendly products and options is clear. Solutions are seen as the engine of innovation worldwide. So let's zoom out from the individual and go to the macro a little bit. Climate programs, policies, and solutions being perceived as positively impacting the development of new technologies. That's what this slide is all talking about. It's saying that 65% of people think that these policies and programs are going to drive technological development. What's interesting about the data here in my sort of very high level view is you might imagine that low, middle, and high income people would have different perspectives on this, or perhaps age groups would have different perspectives, but that's not the case. So you can see in the bottom right hand, on age and income, actually relatively similar perspectives on the role of these policies in driving innovation, which I think is interesting. Roadmap to optimism. All right, so we're into this final section of the presentation here, and we start to sort of talk about what does it mean to drive people from pessimist to optimist, and are there things we can do? So, spoiler alert, it's difficult. The 5 bullet points that you see in the box, think of them as a sort of a compounding effect. If you can get all of these things right, if you can get them moving at the same time, then you can shift somebody from being optimist to pessimist. So if somebody trusts institutions on climate, if they believe companies keep climate commitments, if they see climate progress and news that gives them hope, there are lots of ifs, right? If they believe climate solutions will benefit them in society, and if they believe climate-friendly lifestyles are attractive, then and you can imagine a very complex cross-tabulation exercise that led to these drivers, which is precisely what led to the drivers. But we believe you can move the number of optimists from 22% to 52%, you know, a 30% increase. I just want to caveat, this is not a Pollyannish view of how easy it is to get these 5 drivers moving, but we really wanted to understand what would shift perspective, and this is part of that roadmap. Let's unpack a couple of those. On me and my community, you've got to make the strategies work on these very specific things. So you're seeing here the top 2 box responses for each of business, NGOs, and government. Business. How can business communicate that we support climate, or that action will support climate vulnerable people? That has a significant % likelihood increase in driving trust. Delivering products to help me live with climate change. They're the sort of top 2. NGOs. Inspire me to reduce my footprint, facilitate institutional partnerships, and government balance these needs on climate with affordable energy, make me feel a good life as possible. I think for those of us who've been working in this space for a long time, some of these are a bit intuitive, but at least this data sort of gives us something to aim at versus gut. On policies, there's a bit of a chicken and egg or horse and cart thing going on here. But if you're an optimist, you are 25 points more likely to believe that climate policy is going to benefit your job security. If you're a climate optimist, you're 25 points more likely to see climate action as benefiting your country's economic growth. So we really need to dig into how you move people into this space. The evidence is pretty clear. On media, and fascinated to hear what our panelists here have to say about that a little bit today. But the good news is people want more communication through media about climate change solutions and progress. And it's relatively evenly balanced, actually, I think, between pessimist and optimist. So both groups want to see more practical progress. And on the right-hand side, there's an equal balance in terms of there not being enough climate reporting in the media about climate solutions. So those who are following, there have been huge investments in climate reporting in the last 2 years by a number of media outlets. Really looking forward to hearing how Time has been investing in that space as well. Sell us on a climate-friendly lifestyle. So show me I'm making a difference. That is the most positive, strong association that you can drive. And the most negative on the left-hand side, the most negative association you've got to overcome is show me it requires no more time and effort. How do we want information on the right-hand side of the slide? We've talked about the roles of experts and peers. I think we've intuitively had a sense of this, but perhaps it's good to be reassured that in fact facts matter in these situations. How do we do that effectively? And what do we need to prioritize? We've got to lead with data, make the content more accessible. Last slide here, I think, and then Alex is going to bring the panel up and we'll get the conversation going. What does all this add up to? So does it matter if you are more optimistic or not? And the answer is, we really think so. So you're 19 points more likely to buy or boycott a brand based on their climate actions if you're an optimist, and 17 points more likely to do things to reduce your footprint. Now, not to finish on a negative note, but I still think that sort of 29 number there on the bottom right-hand side and the 46 number, that's still pretty kind of bumping around there, sort of south of 50%. So really would be hoping to see bigger numbers there in the event you're an optimist. Final slide here. So this sort of is the springboard, and Alex, I think perhaps should bring up the folks, but 4 points to take away: invest in optimism, lean into solutions, make expertise accessible, and make policy personal. And I think that's really the frame that we're hoping that the group will come up and stress test a little bit. So with that, Alex, back over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Very much. We do this all the time. We do that. Thank you so much for that. I have been privileged to hear Alex present that data 3 times now. And each time I learn a little bit more. So thanks for that. Can our panelists please come on up? We have a great panel this evening, and I'll introduce them as they take their seats. Just for everyone, so I'm Alex Keith. I'm the US Head of Social Impact and Sustainability and the New York Corporate Affairs Lead here at Edelman. And I am pleased to introduce our panel. We have Sarah O'Brien, the Chief Communications Officer at Rivian, C.D. Glenn, Global Head of Social Impact at PepsiCo, Shaila Raghav, the Chief Climate Officer at Time, and Christula Winiger, Senior Director of Communications and Special Initiatives at United Nations Foundation. So just so you guys know how this is going to go, I'm going to ask a few questions. Each question is going to be directed to 2 of them. They know what's coming, I think, but we might change it. We'll see. These are experts. I'm going to pass the mic to Christula because she's going to get the first question. Let's start with optimism. The key insight from the data is that climate optimists are more likely to advocate and act on climate solutions, but so much of the climate conversation so far has been about doom and gloom. So first Christula and then Shaila, how can we work to create and encourage more climate optimism?
So I have 4 Gen Zs of my very own, and climate anxiety has been a really huge piece of my immediate household, as well as a huge part of my job. And recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, they do these rounds of massive scientific reports each cycle. And each cycle takes 2 or 3 years, depending. This last cycle took like 3.5 because of the pandemic. So this series of reports to be released. And we were able to work with them at the UN Foundation, with the IPCC from the very beginning, with an initiative called Say It With Science. And it's just really resonates with some of the things that Alex was talking about earlier, in this idea that people want to be able to trust experts. They want to understand what the scope of opportunity is, and they want to be able to act. So we've created a whole series of sort of digestible, bite-sized content that could take the key facts of the scientists, work with scientists who are really willing and able to talk to audiences at all levels of technical knowledge, and that part's incredibly important. That Venn diagram of scientists that fits in that box are few and far between, but they're there and they are incredible. And then with that, work with constituencies, Gen Z in particular, who are really inheriting this and taking this fight to the next level. It is one of the most active constituencies that's calling us to account as a planet on climate change issues, and they are both frightened, but they are still optimistic. And I think there are a few things here that we need to think about. Firstly, the window isn't closed. We are not yet extinct. And in fact, if we can turn around and peak our emissions levels before 2025, shouldn't give us much time, and then halve our emission levels between 2025 and 2030, we're still in the window of avoiding mass catastrophic consequences for people and planet. And so that's a message I think that all of us collectively need to be finding ways to tell in our various spheres of influence. That yes, the doom and gloom is out there. It's very real. We're not trying to Pollyanna it. We're not trying to sugarcoat it. And yet the solutions are there. So we've got to communicate. It's on us as communicators. It's about hope. It's about money. It's about ballot boxes. And I'll talk more about that later, but how are we, in those countries where a ballot box is an option, how are people communicating about how they feel about climate in general and climate optimism as an option?
I agree with everything you said. I think for me, also another dimension of optimism really comes down to this idea of agency. And I think for so long, climate change has felt like very distant in time and space. It's felt like it's a problem that is happening to someone else in a far and distant land away from where I am. And I think that the past few years have shattered that notion. I think climate change is now personal for each and every one of us. But at the same time, we have felt helpless and hopeless, and that anything that we do is going to be meaningless in the face of such a large and insurmountable challenge. And so I think optimism really ultimately is a function of agency, and the extent to which we provide people with a path forward, with specific actions and steps that they can take. I also think that optimism is the opposite, or one of an opposite emotion that is necessary. You also need that fire inside of you. And if any of you listen to Outreach and Optimism, it's a podcast that Christiana Figueres and Tom Carnac host. They talk very beautifully about the fact that you need to light a fire inside of you. And oftentimes that comes from the outrage. It comes from seeing the injustice that climate change is imposing around the world. But even as you sit within that outrage, you need something to compel and push you forward day after day. So to me, I see optimism not as kind of a standalone emotion. I see it as a combination of emotions that we all experience on a day-to-day basis as we look at how climate change is affecting us here and today, and each of us in its own way, shape and form.
And each of us need to find that fire, that optimism, and as you talked about, Priscilla, a lot of that optimism is grounded in solutions and can be grounded in solutions. And I think a lot of us think of those solutions as coming from the business community. But as we saw, business is not trusted on climate. Business is trusted less than NGOs and government to do what's right. So for CD first, and then Sarah representing the business community, talk a little bit about how PepsiCo and Rivian are working to increase trust in your work around climate change.
No, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Edelman, for having me. I think I want to start with the reason for being here, if you will, as PepsiCo. So a lot of you may be thinking, okay, what is a soda company? So we're going to talk about climate. Well, we're much more than a soda company. We're the US largest food and beverage company. We source 30 crops from 60 countries around across 7 million acres of land. So yes, there's Pepsi and there's Mountain Dew and there's Gatorade, but there's also Lay's, there's Ruffles, there's Daisy Pita chips, there's Sun chips, and then there's lots of Toads, Doritos, Fritos, in our portfolio. And all of those products are water and they're crops. And so for climate change, this isn't a nice to have. This isn't the feel good philanthropic guy on the side. This is like business survival, then it's business sustainability, and it's business growth. So for us, we put sustainability and human capital at the center of how we're going to drive growth and create value for the company. And so almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, we announced and launched an initiative called PepsiCo Positive, where we want to be positive in our agriculture. All of our work is rooted in agriculture. Again, those Lay's potato chips are potatoes. Doritos are corn. Quaker oats, obviously, are oats. and that, having safe water is really important to any of the beverages that we produce. So for us, sustainability and human capital at the center of how we're going to drive growth and create value is central. That's how we're going to be profitable, by making sure there's a planet and people who grow, source, and we make and we move and we sell those products. And so that's the center of what we do. And so that trust is built by making it clear that it's a responsibility. If I tell you we don't survive and thrive without operating within planetary boundaries, believe us, and you can hold us accountable to that. And so 3 things that I think that we've been very clear on to sort of create trust is by basically saying we're big, we have scale, we have size, we have reach. I mean, you're talking about 360,000 employees, you're talking about 200 markets, you're talking about, again, one of the world's largest food and beverage companies. So we're big, and so we think that's a big responsibility. And in doing so, really thinking about how we actually show up for people and planet. And those are combined for us. So our climate action is rooted in people and the planet, 100%. And so that bigness is the responsibility that we embrace, and we're changing and transforming everything that we do to be responsive to people and to planet. And we think our actions are going to build trust. So our actions are really important in terms of showcasing the impact that we're having. But also, it's really making it personal to the company, making it personal to our employees, making it personal to the growers, to the communities, to everyone, the manufacturers, making it personal to everyone. That's where the people and the planet is inextricably linked for us. And then, so making it personal, really showcasing the impact, and then making it public. And so we have real public commitments that we want to be held accountable for. We want to sit on stages and talk about the commitment that we have to focus on regenerative agriculture across 7 million acres of land, which is almost our entire agricultural footprint. We want to be held accountable to be a net zero positive. We want to be held accountable to sort of think about safe water access, but also net zero emissions goals. So all of these goals are really public. We made them public. We stand on stages. We have 7 senior most executives who are in or on their way to COP right now. It's not like one person showing up and it's the comp person. Nothing wrong with comp people, but it's literally senior most executives, going there to showcase that impact. And so we think by making it personal, we think by making it public, and we think by really showcasing the impact that we're having in our programs that really put sustainability and human capital at the center of how we're going to be profitable, how we're going to create growth and create value. We think that's going to help build the trust. So it's, old school language, putting our money where our mouth is, walking the walk and talking the talk. All those things are very true. And I think that's what people and communities and organizations sort of see as building trust by, again, making it personal to us and to society. Corporations are built based upon and built by people. I'm an individual, our CEOs, an individual. We actually care and we think about our Gen Zers at home, just like everyone else. And so holding our company accountable to people and planet, but then also driving forward those public commitments, and then really making sure we're showcasing these impactful solutions. And that's really critical for a company like PepsiCo, because we actually can be a trendsetter, a catalyst, if we go in a certain direction other people will follow just because of the size and the scale we are. So that's why it's really important for us to be public. It's not all about talking to Edelman people, right? So it's not all about driving corporate reputation, even though it's a part of it. But it is about really showcasing the positive examples to be a catalyst for transformational change with others.
Just to try and answer that question, I thought the best way of trying to do it is just to your point, just be quite personal with this. And for me, I actually left the job I was doing, which was a good job, to go to Rivian because I just believed that what they were doing and what they were saying was real. And within like days of sort of stepping in the building, you kind of might, just sort of breathe a sigh of relief, sort of be like, this is real. And I actually think it's quite important for companies, not only to, I'm fortunate that I work somewhere that the vehicles that we create and the products are absolutely incredible and outstanding and a heck of a lot of fun to drive and sort of all of those things. But I actually felt when I was taking the job that not only was it important to work in a place where you kind of had these incredible products, but also because I think a company like Rivian needs to exist. Because it's very, very rare for a place to start and at the minute that they're about to give their IPO to say we're going to give 1% of our worth of our entire company back to the planet. So if we're successful, the planet will be successful. Like I've never heard of anyone doing something like that before. And therefore to me, it's just important to actually be in places that you really believe are real. So I think for me, that's the most important part when it sort of comes to communications is not only, and actually being part of the business is not only just thinking through, actually, is it important? How do we communicate this and what are we going to say? But it's just that you just want the essence of it to actually be real. And if it's not, then really push for it to be. I just feel very fortunate that I ended up in somewhere that I just think is quite unique.
Yeah, let's stay with you because the next question is about storytelling specifically, right? One of the data points that we saw was that no matter whether you're a climate pessimist or a climate optimist, you're looking for more reporting on climate solutions. And so we'll start with you and then to Shyla. How do we tell better stories about climate change? And how do you get those out in the media, especially in this super saturated environment? I mean, we're seeing the media has made tons of new investments in climate. Every outlet has climate reporters now. So how do you break through with those stories and how do you tell them?
I absolutely love everything Alex was saying about optimism. I just think that is beyond critical to be able to actually sort of really break through. For us, it's trying to tell stories. Again, I just sort of real and try and halo on the work that we're doing and how you use some technology to solve some of these really impossible problems and just how exciting that is. I would love more people to cover sustainability and climate in more of a way that Alex was saying, where it's actually just like these are the solutions that we have and they may not be perfect and there's loads of stuff that we could probably get a bit more right, but at least it's a step in the right direction. I know that's asking a lot. I would, like I think journalists can hold to account at the same time, but just that level of optimism, I think for us, it's sort of really important to show people a future that you want to be part of and a planet that you want to be in. So even just, the content that we create and how we look at things, it's really just, our stance is just like keep the world adventurous forever because we just really believe that we all want to be here. And forever is super important. So even just sort of visually giving people something like, to the point that you made, just hope. And I think you do that in storytelling through media. I think you do that in storytelling through your content. I think so.
And very much agree. At time, we have really made a concerted effort in recognition of the fact that we have to go beyond just reporting on news, because we're just going to devolve into biasing our reporting for where there's conflict or where there's, an accusation of greenwashing, and you're going to see is that the coverage is going to be skewed towards what's negative and what's going to kind of lead to that kind of negative engagement. And so we've made this huge commitment to not just report on climate, but actually go beyond that to activate business audiences, to actually see that acting on climate change is not against their best interest, right? We can't just hit people in the head with facts. We also have to hit them in the heart. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do with the storytelling, is we want to evoke more of an emotional response. We want companies to feel like they will be left behind if they don't act on climate change, that climate action and business value are connected, not in opposition with one another. And so we've recently also taken on a few projects. So one being the Time Climate 100. So Time celebrates the person of the year. It has a list of 100 most influential people in the world. And we've recently launched a Time 100 climate list, which celebrates leaders across sectors, across different levels of governance, different levels within the business, entrepreneurs, activists, really acknowledging this ecosystem of leaders that are going to be really necessary to be able to accelerate those solutions and implement them in many different ways.
One of the data points you talked about really hitting people in the heart, getting more personal. One of the data points that really stuck out to me in our study is that the top action businesses can take to earn trust is to support climate vulnerable people. And I think we talk in the climate community a lot about weather patterns and things that are sort of intangible, extreme events, flooding, heat waves, but those events disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. And so I think that in the same breath, we talk about climate mitigation and adaptation, we need to talk about climate justice. I think that's clear in our data. So this is for CD first and then Crisula. How are you guys thinking about the people side of climate change? You started to address it, but a little bit more. And also, how should we, as a community, as representatives of different institutions, how should we be taking, supporting, and demanding action on climate justice from institutions?
A great questions, very, very thought-provoking and deep, so I'll try to be fast, but I wanted to go back a little bit to optimism just because I think it's really, really important is how you show up and the authentic nature of the company you represent or the organization that you represent. And so, as I mentioned, our transformation with sustainable and human capital is called PepsiCo Positive. So we're sort of saying, and we've all grown up in a world where business should be a positive force for good. We're embodying that. We're saying PepsiCo is positive in our agriculture, in our value chains, and the choices that we put out. We can be more positive. We also have sort of a tagline that says more smiles. We want to create more smiles with every sip and every bite. If I talk about any of our products, it's going to give you an optimistic nature. So if I tell you the vulnerability of those smiles are because the climate is under extreme pressure, then hopefully that's inviting you to help fix it because we all want to smile. We all want a more smile with every sip and every bite. So I think that optimism piece it's number one, I think, for a reason. In terms of how we actually think about climate justice and how we think about people and all that, in all of our programs that are climate focused, climate smart, climate resilient programs, my job as president of the foundation, global head of social impact, is to think about the S in the ESG and to think about the people. And so as we talk about a sustainable agricultural food system, as we talk about a regenerative agricultural food system, we talk about inclusive. And so that's youth and women. The average age of a farmer across the world, 60 plus. So the future of growing the food, and we all know the intersectionality of climate and agriculture. I don't want to tell this audience or anybody listening in. And so the future of how we feed the future is being inclusive and thinking about those who are most vulnerable, whether they're youth, whether they're women who are toiling in agriculture, whether unseen, under resources, unpaid, the drudgery, and how do we improve their lives. So a real focus around not only how we're farming, and PepsiCo is committed to that being regenerative, but who's farming, and thinking about those issues and the vulnerabilities that farming actually that persist in agriculture, those vulnerabilities. So our program with CARE, we're going to impact the lives and livelihoods of 5 million female smallholder farmers around the world. And yes, we're talking about increasing their yields and increasing their incomes, but we're also talking about climate smart, climate resilient agriculture. We're talking about how they're using irrigation methods that actually lessen the water usage, but make the production more efficient. We have programs, our safe water, our program in water, yes, it's climate specific. We want to, talk about being net water positive. replenishing as much as we take out for all the great beverages that we enjoy. But then I get to focus on, meaning it's an opportunity. I get to focus on how those water programs, to being net water positive, are really talking also about safe water access for 100 million people. So having these real commitments that are climate commitments, but also that are people commitments, is how we sort of think about justice, where it's equitable, it's inclusive, it's really, really intentional, where we have planetary goals, science-based planetary goals, but we also have people and social impact goals aligned with every commitment that we have. And we think that's what's going to be more just, because it's equitable, it's inclusive, and it's really intentional around the lives and livelihoods of particular populations of people who are most vulnerable.
As we sit here in our incredible surroundings and reap, there you go, and reap the benefits of the miracle that is New York City, and greatest city in the world, and you know, and at the epicenter, if not geographically, at least on every other level of America, you know, we also have to remember that the miracles that brought us to this point have not been made available to huge swaths of the world, and they also rightly want their chance at this kind of experience that we've created, the American dream. And so we've got this huge gap between those who are hungry for more development, are being told by the powers that be, you can't have that because we've got to cut emissions, right? And so we have to look at equity from a multiplicity of angles here. It's about showcasing and developing pathways to economic empowerment and growth in countries that rightly see their future as needing certain assets to be available to them. At the same time, these are the same countries who are they're at the sharp edge of the sword, if you like, of climate consequences. So they are the ones whose buildings aren't as up to code when an earthquake hits. They're the ones whose early warning systems are not non-existent. And so when the cyclones come, the hurricanes, etc., their building materials may not as safe, etc., their water supply is not as clean. You get the picture. So we're dealing with these huge gaps. And we've got to be able to mitigate not only for climate solutions, but also be able to tackle adaptation. These things have to be operating in parallel and simpatico with each other. I'll give you a couple of examples. So early warning systems. This is something where the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has made a huge commitment to ensure that in the next 5 years, every person in the world will have access to an early warning system, including last mile access, right? It's extraordinarily ambitious program. But we know it works. The World Bank talks about saving $35 billion a year in the 20% of damage that won't happen if we have early warning systems everywhere in the planet. We have a success story that we can point to in Bangladesh, for example, where over the last 40 years, as cyclones have increased, their damage footprint has increased, the amount of water they're dropping is increased. Bangladesh has seen a decline in the amount of impacts in country. And that has been largely attributed through various studies to their early warning systems and the strengthening of those early warning system opportunities. So we've got to think about climate justice in the sense of economic development. We've got to think about climate justice in the sense of adaptation. We've got to think about climate justice in terms of who's affected most when disaster hits. And it's predominantly, as it always has been, the poor and the needy in this country and in any other country on the planet. So there's an obligation there. And just before I close, I mean, there's, alluding back to my earlier point around the ballot box, whether you have the opportunity to vote or whether you have you live in a country where you can somehow subversively make your point known, right? Whatever means are available to you to make your point to governments, political pressure really matters. And this is one of the tools that we've had in our arsenal of being able to tackle these issues. So we need to show to our politicians that we care about this, that we're doing our best, going back to this idea of individual action, showing me that individual action works. individual action actually isn't going to work unless governments come to the party. It has to be joined. But if you, as an optimistic, doing your very best human being voter, can say to your elected official in this country, hey, I'm doing all the things. I'm driving an electric car. I'm recycling my electronics. I'm composting. I'm doing my best here. What are you doing? And by the way, you work for me. So in this country, you are privileged. Our elected officials work for us. We are their bosses. So one of the greatest individual actions that we can be exerting is how we vote. And going back to some of the information Alex presented earlier, we not only believe experts, we also believe our peers. So are you talking to people about what you hold to be dear in taking personal climate action? No, personal climate action is not enough. It never will be. But it's a start, and it gives you a platform of authority to then go to the ballot box and to go lobby if you were willing to.
I think the work ahead is complex and clear. There's a lot to do. I have last question. We're going, and then we'll open it up and see if folks have some questions. But last question for this panel of experts: as you look ahead, we've got sort of right on the horizon, we've got COP28, and then moving forward, we've got all of this complexity into 2024, and how should we be thinking about climate action and the work we need to do? So from your standpoint, what are you hoping to see either at the conference or in the next year? And what do we need to be thinking about, moving forward to make sure that we're taking the right action?
Sure, I can start. I think this is going to be a very contentious and challenging COP, and I think anyone who's been reading any of the news coverage or the commentary around it will appreciate why. And so my hope for this COP in particular is unification. I think especially the climate community is very divided right now. We almost see that we're in this circular firing squad, and I experienced this a lot when I worked on nature and natural climate solutions, that it almost felt like to advocate for your own solution, you have to disparage or criticize another solution. So you often see a narrative, nature versus tactical, or you see the opposite. Forget trees, it's all about technology. We're gonna carbon remove our way out of the problem. And I think it's a really destructive kind of discussion and a very destructive narrative, because it creates this unnecessary competition. And you also see the same thing now with the private sector and activism, and there's really no kind of mediated intermediary space of constructive dialogue and productive conversation about how we can come together. So my hope is that we can break through of that division and create a space for radical collaboration at this COP.
One of the things I'm really excited to watch in this COP is that the first health special day of health is happening this Saturday. And I think all of us have been watching the intersections between climate and health impacts and just how significant and I think under acknowledged they are. And it also, a little SDG pin here, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals for people on the planet, and also prosperity, never forget that part. The entire agenda was written with the idea of sustainability in mind, and it was written also with intersectionality at its very core. And so for the climate community around COP to finally sort of acknowledge and bring out and have more intersectional content around gender, around peace and security, or the prevention of conflict, around sustainable cities, or every single goal that is represented by the Sustainable Development Goals that all 193 member states of the UN ratified in 2015. There's an opportunity, a further opportunity to hold them accountable. But in particular, health has been one of the ones that I've been most worried about when we look to pandemic preparedness, when we look to any kind of argument that climate change is over there. It's just not, it's all around us. And so to be able to more strategically and with unity, look at some of these intersection points more deeply, I think that's a huge step forward.
You're gonna hear a theme here because you heard unity, you heard health as a climate issue. And my hope, my prayers, my optimism is around the increased push for intersectionality as a key forcing function for greater climate justice, greater climate awareness, greater climate action. And so even from the PepsiCo standpoint, with those executives that are showing up, they're showing up to talk about our focus on regenerative agriculture. That's not it. They're also showing up to talk about our focus on renewable energy. And they're also showing up to talk about our focus and commitment to circularity, particularly circularity in plastics. So these are 3 different issues that are very siloed sometimes, that are all coming together in COP. And so that intersectionality and embracing of health and other issues in the climate space is groundbreaking, regardless of where COP is taking place. And really quickly, to sort of date myself, I went to COP17. It was called the Africa COP. It was in Durban. Oh my God, climate in Africa, because climate was all about mitigation. And then all of a sudden, hey, we have to focus on adaptation and agriculture and climate. It was new, less than 10 years ago, 10 years ago. What COPs didn't talk about agriculture. And now we have somebody on the stage talking about climate and health. And so that push for intersectionality, it also was that COP17 was also in Africa. And now we have COP, whether we want to say it or not, in a petronation, being hosted by a petronation. So we know the progress that we're making. This is going to be, fractures, and there are going to be some real challenges, but there is sort of a focus that climate is ubiquitous at this point, that it's all encompassing, that it's personal. And my hope and my prayer and my optimism is that we keep pushing forward, that climate is a unifying issue that we all get behind from our various vantage points and keep pushing forward for progress.
Just to close it out, because I'm a comms person and I just like everything to do with circle, is I actually just hope for all of us here and all of us who do these sorts of jobs and everyone that goes, that you're on, we're just looking at solutions from a vantage of optimism. Because I just think without it, you just can't really see an end that you all want to be part of. So that would be my absolute hope for everyone, and also just for everyone who works in this field. I think we were talking earlier about how hard it can be, because you're sort of just, you're looking at data, you're looking at the facts, and it's really, really hard. So I just think the optimism that we all have, I think is really going to be critical to getting the solutions we need.
Thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise. And I think your final point is such a valuable one. All of us here in the room and virtually coming together as a community is also a very important piece of this, right? We're all dealing with this in our own way, and it can be a grind. You're right. We can talk about optimism, but this can be a grind. So if we move forward with optimism and unification and intersectionality and justice together, we have a real opportunity here. At this point, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. I'm sure that Alex has a question if nobody else has. Oh, Margot.
First of all, thank you guys so much. It was an incredibly interesting panel. So thank you again for all being here. My question is, what do you guys think is going to happen during the 2024 election in the US? How do you think the dialogue around climate is going to change? So I, for one, am like a little apprehensive, to be honest.
Are you running a boat, Margot?
No. Stay out of that one. Anyone?
Well, I mean, I think it's just, it's going to be a hotly debated topic on every single side of the spectrum. Yeah. I don't know what else to say other than I just think this is just going to be talked about more than it ever has been talked about. It's sort of like you're going back to like, we all just need to lock arms together and just sort of really support each other over the next year. I think it's going to be a really tough one.
Do we have anyone from Pew here? No, or other research organisations? I think there is a comment here I would just mention. There's a tension between that 97% number and the stat ranking of voter issues historically, particularly in the United States, right? So when you look at Pew's priority issues, it's very, very, very rarely climate in there. It's always bouncing around the bottom. And that's where this intersectionality comment becomes really powerful. And that's where the message is incredibly important. So you can only be powerful on climate in an electoral cycle if you're taking it to other issues. I think folks will just introduce themselves briefly.
My name is Erin McKeown. I work at Edelman. My question would be, as a Gen Zer in the room, I think that we as a generation have lived through a time of kind of mass climate destruction in such a short amount of time. And my friends, people I know, a lot of them have kind of reached the point of 0% optimism, choosing things like to not have children when they would maybe want to because of the state of the climate, something they think about every day, and not wanting to have a kid in this environment. How do we work to turn someone maybe so devastated by the consequences of climate change from that 0% optimism point to a place where they see a possibility of reform, they see a possibility of solution, and they see like a probability of forever? Because I think right now in our generation, especially living through the pandemic so recently at such a young age, it's really hard.
I think about this all the time. I have my 2 older kids, both daughters are they're not having children for all the reasons you just articulated. So both from a personal perspective, but then also from the things that I do every day for a living, this is front of mind. I'll say a couple of things, and we talked a little bit about this earlier. We've got to get more comfortable, and we've got to do a better job at helping Gen Z get more comfortable with paradox. Multiple things can be true at the same time. The world is horrifying. The world is glorious. And all of the other examples that come to your mind with that kind of nexus, right? So I think that is an onus on all of us as professionals. It's an onus on us as educators. It's an onus on us as those of us that are parents, aunties, grandparents, all the things, siblings, to be able to help the circles in which we move understand paradox. And it is the hardest thing, because our job, we've been told since day one as communicators that we're supposed to stick to one message, and there's one answer, and there's one key message that we want everyone to walk away with. We've got to get more nuanced. We've got to get more comfortable with complexity. It doesn't answer your question. I don't have the answer. If I had it, then I would be shouting it from the rooftops. But I do know that this segmentation into this or this, we've got to close that gap in really meaningful ways.
I would just maybe add very quickly, and I feel like climate change is oftentimes portrayed as something happening to you, and you're completely powerless in that situation. And back to my point about agency, and I do think that there needs to be an opportunity conversation and a responsibility one. And I think that's where you have this path forward in terms of what you can actually do and what's your role to play. And it kind of also goes back to the kind of power of individual action, which you had kind of spoken really clearly about. There was this kind of initial time where it was measure your carbon footprint, but then there was, I would think, almost an overcorrection, where now all of the conversation is skewed towards what is corporate responsibility, and it has eroded this sense of the importance of individual action. And I think we have to bring that pendulum back towards the middle, where we really see this as a shared responsibility, and individuals are comprise corporations, comprise our government leaders, and also have power in and of ourselves. And I think we need to continue to have that conversation, that narrative. Otherwise, we're going to continue in this space of helplessness.
Ira Gorski, Edelman. A follow-up question on nuance, because one of the things which I believe hurts the environmental narrative is things like going after natural gas when we're still burning coal, or electric vehicles on coal-fired generation. So how do you address the nuance of a narrative when there are things that are problematic? Because opponents will accuse people from an environmental perspective of being intellectually dishonest. So how do you get that nuance across?
Yeah. I'm lucky that I work for an EV company that doesn't use coal. But if I did, I think a huge part of it is just being really honest on the challenge. You know, these things, and like supply chain, really, really difficult. Like electrifying a grid. It's really, really complicated. I think part of it is just actually explaining what the problem is. It sounds so obvious, but explain what the problem is. And therefore, like, all of the steps that go along to the solution. Because I've had it many times where it's, I've been speaking to reporters, it's a similar sort of thing. And actually, when you say, yeah, like this is a really, really hard thing to solve through technology or through all of the things that we're trying to do it, but these are the steps that we're taking. However, we still need to think about X, Y, Z. And just being blatantly honest on what the problem is. To me, that's always just been the most effective way. And it's just most often the most obvious answer in the world, but I just that's the best way.
It may seem obvious, but not everybody's willing to do it.
Right.
And I think we used to get, because it was an excuse before, we used to get punished for it. So I think progress over perfection. I think words like journey. I think, again, all the cliches things from the 80s, 90s, now Gen Z, they actually get it because that individual action, I think coming back to that because they want to see, there's instant gratification, right? That's part of the deal that we're dealing with. We want instant gratification. So if they're doing something instantly, but you're staying where the goal line is, or you're saying what the commitment is, ultimately talking about that progress. And then they're these cliche, but every single step does, equal that, is on that step to a marathon to 26 miles. So I think it is that nuance of that we do have a goal, we are making a difference, because without that, it's hard to lean into the optimal, because it is a daunting challenge. And that is what sort of really leads to paralysis, because it is so big. But I think when we're able to nuance and talk about that progress over perfection, that it is a journey. Now, again, these are the same words that were used to not do anything. It's too hard, it's going to be a journey, it's, so that's part of the challenge, is the nuance of old for non-committal and inaction were kind of the same words that we need now to show that we are committed. But I think it's ringing truer now because they do see it's not only Tesla. Yeah. There's momentum happening. So again, that's the other thing, taking these moments to real momentum. And so saying, yes, that was a catalyst, and now we're talking about transformational change, and it will take time, but you get credit for starting, which, in the past, we didn't want to start, we just wanted to make the excuse.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think the journey is very important. And I think what you guys do really well, and what you were talking about is just reiterating, explaining the problem, right? Because we can actually we can talk about that now in ways that people weren't open to that previously. It's almost like the intersectionality of these problems is understood. And so when we're honest about the intersectionality of the problems we're facing as a business, we have an opportunity to actually prove out the journey that you're talking about. CD.
Yeah, because you didn't want to show that vulnerability before.
That's right.
You didn't want to say how hard it was, because you're, this is sort of inside your corporate walls. You don't want to show those were competitive, points. And now they're actually collaborative points, because we all know it's really hard to solve these problems. So we're actually being more honest and more vocal because it's necessary.
We have time for about one more question, but we'll hang out afterwards. Yes.
Hi. My name is Elena Lynch. I run a leadership development and executive coaching consultancy. I have previously worked in kind of purpose, brand strategy type of work. So I'm very curious, like it does feel like the last few years, there has been a bit of a backlash starting to brew around ESG, purpose marketing. Everyone got into it. There were some broken promises, mistakes made. I feel like we're seeing the backlash. I think this has all come to head now. We've all watched the saga with OpenAI. I think even just some of the reporting that's come out after that. There was, sorry, slight tangent, but relevant. There was a really good piece in The Atlantic that Charlie Basel wrote. It was, I don't know if anyone saw that, but it was called "It's All About the Money," or it all comes down to the money. We've got Scott Galloway on CNN saying this is the death of ESG reporting, that corporations are really good at making money and they should just stick with that. And it's just a really interesting time. So I was super curious to come tonight to see this, and now looking at the data saying, okay, this is real. People aren't trusting businesses as much with this anymore. And I'm just, what does that mean for businesses now? I think Rivian's obviously a very purpose-led business. That's like the Patagonia, the Ben and Jerry's of the world, PepsiCo, lots of investment to kind of put towards that. But what happens to everyone in between? What about all the business leaders in between? Where do we go from now? Do they double down on this and try and rebuild the trust, or is that hurting the movement overall? Should they be giving space to government, NGOs? Long question, and it's a loaded one, but I'm just, I think it's relevant for the time that is.
I just think businesses, we have, time's running out. So my stance would be like, I just wouldn't wait. Because I just don't think anyone can, I don't think the planet can afford for us all to sort of sit around and debate, well, what would you like? It's just, so I don't, it makes this sad, I think we called it sad lash. That's kind of what it is.
Wow, I like
It's
that.
like a Freudian slip, I'm sure. But like, we can't really, there's no time for it. So for me, I just think even if you're a business that, you know, isn't in the position of brilliant, where you kind of set up the company with climate first. If we get it right, I just think that's just such a proof point to be able to show actually, like, if you're going to set up a company, you just try and do it like this and actually make a business case as to how this works. But I just think even if you're not, you're a super established business that's been around for a really long time, we can't wait. We can't wait.
Do you mind if I just build on that? So to that point, we want to show that these businesses make money. Must.
Yeah.
Absolutely critical. So when you have leaders who, like Rudian, can, it's going to be a journey, right? But that is critical. Just a couple of other points on this question, and other panelists may have a word or two. Firstly, there is an answer to the quote backlash question, and it is not a homogenous answer. So we have country cuts by each of these 13 countries, and the story looks different country to country. Firstly, and very, very happy to share that with anybody who's on the phone or in this room. The story in the US is very different from the story in France, as an example. Second, on backlash, the couple of other data points from other studies. These are similar in scale, these studies, and they look at employees and their attitudes to companies. So it's like a startling statistic. So if you're like, you've not finished scribbling yet with your talking points, here's another one. An employee is 8 times more likely to consider a company as an employer, and for that to be a deal breaker for them, considering their climate action, 8 times more likely. 14.5 times more likely if a company has clear action on human rights. It's like a very big number, and I can't remember when the work-based study fielded, but I think it was July, August. So it's really, really recent. And there are other data as well that indicates not only for employees, but if you go outside, we spent a lot of time looking at this. If you go outside the United States and you start talking about backlash, half of the countries that we work with look at you with a blank face. They're like, what are you talking about? Trains left the station, guys, and it's not fueled as it used to be. And it's really, really, sorry, I wasn't a deliberate pun, but I think it's incredibly important for us not to allow the US media echo chamber to govern how we think about this on a global basis.
Can I add?
Yeah.
Just super quickly, nomenclature matters, obviously we want standards around things like terminology like ESG. On the other hand, I don't care what you call it, as long as you're doing it.
Yeah, I think, it's funny, backlash, sad lash, which I love, to be honest, as an optimist. But, there was actually Loretta Lynch, so it's funny when I heard your name, I was like, huh? Who was the former Attorney General. She was talking about John Lewis, the civil rights icon, congressman, and talking about when he was, freedom marches and freedom rides, and it was sort of during the worst times. I mean, they were getting brutalized and beaten. It was like, take a pause, take a break, regroup, take your time, but it was never turn back. There was never a statement about turn back. So for me, it is about walking the walk. It is about talking the talk, and it is about fighting the fight. And I think Alex said it best. This is and I was in U.S. government, so I've, been from the government here to help, representing this nation. As soon as you have a global mindset, you see around the world that what we're doing, sometimes it's not even about, it's like accelerates. The rest of the world is like, why are you holding back? you have the ability, you have the opportunity, and you have the competitive advantage to really scale in different ways. So I do think that the momentum is here, and there's a time, but it's not time to turn back, but it is to lean into your values. It really, from a company like ours, it really is, what do you really believe in? It is those hard days worth the long reward of profitability through a purpose-driven company or through a focus on people and planet. So we have made a bet on the next 100 years that says we're going to be a positive company, PepsiCo positive, and our agriculture, our value chains, and our choices that we put out, and it's transforming. We want you to enjoy Cheetos, but they're also going to be chickpea potato chips, with more, more, nutrition, but also lessening some of the negative externalities. But at the end of the day, it is a progress towards real perfection in terms of being this positive force for good, but it's not easy. And it's definitely going to have a lot of headwinds, and then the tailwinds will come, and then the headwinds will come, but it's like staying in the course. So it's really about being values driven, because this is not an easy or fast fight. It really is. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. And that's where I think there's also this competitive and pre-competitive alliances where business is coming together with media, with NGOs, with, coming together, what we see, quote unquote, in COP to some extent, to push these things forward, because going it alone is not really, there's no competitive advantage to that. Also, these problems are too big.
On that note, I'd like to say thank you so much to our panel. And we're all hanging out, and there's some drinks and hors d'oeuvres. Thank you.
Can we take a quick picture, the four of us?
Yes.
Yeah,